everyone agrees that one of the most controversial topics when it comes to philosophy, theology, everything has to do with the origin of all things, not just of the cosmos, but with you and I, humans in general. So help us to think through some of these issues. Um, uh, what are some of the secular, non-Christian views of how we got here, the beginning of the universe and us as well? What are some of those views?
Yeah, so just in terms just secular views.
Hmm.
Yeah, so there really isn't a how we got here. There's really only a we got here. So the two primary views are one that we just came here out of nothing. The second one is that we've always been here, sort of like we would say that God is from eternity to eternity. Many would say that the universe is eternity to eternity. So those are the two primary options, and there would be some dispute, I'm sure, among that some cosmologists, but generally those are the two camps that we're looking at when it comes to the origin of the universe.
So what do you mean by from eternity to eternity? And as it relates to, how does that explain how stars got in the sky and mountains got in western part of America?
Right. So, as far as eternity to eternity goes, so no beginning, no end. Now, keep in mind that this doesn't necessarily mean that there was no Big Bang.
Hmm.
So, the standard cosmological model for the origin of the universe, as far as secularism goes,
Hmm.
is the Big Bang theory,
Yeah.
which states that the universe essentially just came from a single point. And so they wouldn't necessarily deny a Big Bang, but what they would say is that in some form, some way, the universe has existed, always has, and
Hmm.
always will. So,
Okay.
and then in terms of, you mentioned stars, we have through a series of naturalistic processes,
Hmm.
stars were formed. They would talk about gas clouds, things of that nature.
Yeah.
We could go into that, but that's essentially how it is. Basically, no guiding process from God
Right.
whatsoever.
So your options are either everything started at the Big Bang, so that's the beginning, or um, there was existence prior to the Big Bang, whether it's the gases or whatnot that led to the explosion. That's kind of your choices. But everything really begins with the Big Bang as we know it now. Whatever is before that may be mysterious. So those are kind of your options.
Correct.
It's Big Bang or Big Bang a little bit more. A
Yeah.
little bit for it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Exactly.
Well, that's not the view of Christians. Not that Christians don't interact with some of those worldviews, but Christians begin first with the Bible.
Mhm.
So what are, when it comes to the origin of humanity, the origin of the universe, and everything that we know, what are some of the Christian options that we have?
Right. So the only viable Christian view is that God is the one who is eternity to eternity. Much like they would say the universe is, God had no beginning, he will have no end, and therefore he's the one who created the universe. And that makes more logical sense because God is outside of time. So theoretical physicists have these concepts of space and time, but according to theoretical physicists, they're not two separate things. They're two expressions of the same thing. So we are in what is called space time,
Hmm.
and space time has has limits. It's finite, and so that's one of the reasons we know that the universe isn't eternal is because it is bound by space-time. God, on the other hand, by definition, necessarily is not bound by space-time. So we would say that God created space-time matter, and that is the origin of the universe as we know it.
So that's the first verse of the Bible, space, time, matter.
Yeah.
In the beginning, God created heavens and earth, space, time, matter. So that first verse means there was a time before time, and before there was time, there was God. And
Correct.
so time itself traces its origin to him. Okay,
And
so
before is a convenience term, by the way. There really isn't a before. There is no then before the universe.
right,
Uh,
the word before implies time.
right.
So, but we don't have a term in English because we're bound by the limits of time. So we could just do the best we can.
Yeah.
Okay, so Christians' big picture, virtually all Orthodox believers hold to a God who has intervened into space time and created, not just intervened, but created those things.
Mhm.
So when it comes to age of the universe or how creation came about, What are some of the arguments Christians have developed? Because we don't all agree. Some will say the earth is old, some will say it's young. What are some of the main options that most people will hold on to
Hmm.
when it comes to origins?
Among Christians.
Yeah, Christians. Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. So they all there's tons of them, but they all fall into three primary camps. So we have young Earth creationism, or as I would call it, biblical creationism. There's old Earth creationism, and then there is theistic evolution.
Okay. Okay. So what is the difference between those three?
So, young Earth creationism holds a very literal view of the book of Genesis. So, God created in 6 24-hour days. Universe was created approximately 6 to 10,000 years ago. I think it was 6,000, but some say would say 10,000.
Hmm.
And they would just say that it's a very, very straightforward from the text reading of the book of Genesis,
Hmm.
as opposed to the current consensus among scientists, which is that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, universe 13.8 billion. Now, old Earth creationists would essentially bring this idea of an old Earth. So, yeah, Earth is 4.5 billion years old, universe is 13.8 billion years old. And they would say that that fits within the book of Genesis.
Hmm.
So the universe is that old,
Hmm.
and that's okay. That can fit within the biblical time frame. And there's a variety of different camps that will tell you how that's possible. For example, gap theory. There's a gap in between uh, the first two verses of Genesis,
Hmm.
and that there's long periods of time in there. Some would say that the genealogies in the book of Genesis, when you add up from Adam all the way to Abraham, that there are gaps in that
Hmm.
genealogy because we have gaps in other genealogies in the Bible. So there's just different ways that you can incorporate that in, and then theistic evolution and
Before we do
yeah,
theistic, I want to look at this first. So, young Earth is going to be a very literal reading
yes,
of the text, including the math regarding genealogies.
correct,
So
yes.
you're going to start with, okay, here's a known point, Solomon, whatever it is, and we're going to look at all the genealogies, Genesis 5, Genesis 11, so on and so forth, all of the Chronicles, particularly First Chronicles, and you're going to say, okay, this person lived X amount of years
Mhm.
before him. This person was born that many years before. You can go all the way back, and you're going to end up with, say, a little over 4,000 BC is the beginning of, say, Adam and Eve, whatever.
Correct.
And so the genealogies are accurate. So in terms of hard data of years, the genealogies are critical.
Yeah, that's a good thing to bring up because that one of the ways that we know that the Earth is only a few thousand years old is because when you start with the time of Adam, or you start with Adam, and then you go down the list, and it says Adam begot Cain, and then or Seth, I rather, and then goes down the list. We can add up those ages,
Hmm.
and then we can go through to the time of Jesus, and then we know approximately how many years ago Jesus was on the earth,
Hmm.
so we can come around to around 6,000 years. Now we can't have an exact date for the Earth, but it's approximately 6,000 years. So yes, that would be the young Earth view, and it would also be my view
Yeah.
of as well.
So an old Earth creationism would take the genealogies and say each genealogy is different with its own reason for being there, rather than just reporting. So they are going to skip generations, like
Hmm.
Matthew did, and Luke's different, and but then they're going to see the word day in Genesis 1 to 2, not as 24-hour period,
Hmm.
but they're going to emphasize a general period of creation,
Hmm.
and so they're not going to be as literal. However, young and old earth creationism, it is a creationism. It's God's active creative power in on the earth. So it's not so much God wound the clock, the little toy, and it took off,
Hmm.
and he sat back to see what would happen.
Hmm.
But rather, God said, "Let there be light," and that's why there's light. And God said, "Let there be land come out of the sea," and that's why there's land. So it's not an accidental byproduct, but rather he proactively created. Okay, so this other view we want to talk about was theistic evolution. So what is that?
Right. So at its most elemental, theistic evolution is this idea that now when we say evolution, of course, we have to distinguish between two types, right? There's macroevolution and
Hmm.
there's microevolution. Microevolution is what we see all the time in, say,
Hmm.
mosquitoes, or not, I'm sorry, moths. Moth wings can change color based on the environment that they're in.
Hmm.
Basically, the best species to survive, or let me say that again. Uh, the most fit to survive will survive, and those genes will be passed on.
Hmm.
Macroevolution argues that all life on Earth descended from a common ancestor.
Hmm.
So we're all in some sense related. And that's a problem, at least young Earth and old Earth creationists would argue that that's a problem in regards to God creating it or the biblical story of creation. But theistic evolution would say that evolution is the mechanism through which God created and how we got to where we are today.
So it assumes evolution.
Correct.
So whereas old Earth creationism doesn't necessarily do that. It may buy into some evolutionary ideas.
Mhm,
After all, the age of the Earth would be one,
mhm,
but not necessarily macro. So micro and macro. Micro, virtually everyone holds on to that. It's observable changes.
mhm.
The finches is a classic example that comes to mind.
Right.
The size of the beak is determined by its access to food. Does it need to be longer? Do you dig deeper? So on and so forth. Macro evolution is we start as a single cell amoeba, and over billions of years we become intelligent humans, you know.
Yeah.
And so it's an evolution across species.
Mhm.
So it's not that we come from monkeys, but that we and monkeys have a common ancestry. And so that's that issue of species really
Mhm.
sets macro away from micro. Okay,
Correct.
so theistic evolution, they adopt hook, line, and sinker.
Actually, I do want to point something out. There is a difference between species and kind.
Okay.
So we can see different species forming because all a species is just two organisms that are able to breed with one another.
Hmm.
So we've seen like new species of fruit flies being able to form. That's very different from, say, a kind, which is what a creation term. God
Yeah.
created everything according to its kind. So
Yeah.
I always tell people to distinguish between that because we do see new species forming all the time.
Hmm.
But there is a limited amount of information in the DNA,
Yeah.
and that information pretty much stays the same,
Right.
if not decays over time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. That's helpful. Thank
yeah,
you. So theistic evolution, but it's theistic.
correct.
So what is the theism? And
Mhm.
how is that different from just a secular scientist who just holds to evolution and Charles Darwin? So what is the theistic evolution and just regular naturalistic evolution?
Yeah, so honestly, it depends on who you talk to. But generally, the idea is that God does exist, and God used evolution to create. So God created. Some theistic evolutionists will take a view that God was very active in the evolutionary process. Some of the more popular theistic evolutionists will argue that there were multiple species of humans, and that one of those species was taken up and made into the image of God. And so would be where we get the Imago Dei from, being made in the image of God. A lot of theistic evolutionists, and this is actually a real point of tension today in the intelligent design movement, which of course is the movement sort of against this godless origin uh, explanation. There's sort of a tension right now between those who would say God is very much active and those who would say, well, yeah, God's there, but I don't want to say anything about his role in
Mhm.
evolution. But generally speaking, when somebody uses the term theistic evolution, they mean that evolution is the mechanism through which God created all of the life that we see today.
Okay. So a naturalistic evolution would, for the most part, be uncomfortable with the talk of God's involvement. It's just a natural process. Big Bang, we crawl out of some sort of swamp. Somehow we got those legs. Um, Theistic evolution would say, well, yeah, the Big Bang caused because God made it cause, and then but it's still evolution, right? So okay, I see the difference. But what is attractive about theistic evolution? Because it is a prominent view within Christian circles,
Mhm.
biologos and others. So why are so many attracted to theistic evolution as opposed to the others?
Yeah, a few different reasons come to mind. One is just the idea that I mean, we as a society in Western society, we don't like tension.
Hmm.
We don't like to confront people. We don't like conflict, and so we like to live peaceably. And so we're willing to compromise on issues like evolution. So we can say, well, evolution isn't necessarily contrary to God. Uh, so that's one of those. That's sort of peacekeeping mentality. Like, yeah, God could have done it. One thing that you'll hear is It doesn't matter how God did it. It's just that God did
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of truth to that, but it really depends on what you're willing to smuggle in to your theology there.
Yeah.
And another reason that it's attractive, I think a lot of people, truth be told, I think a lot of people are embarrassed about the Genesis account.
Hmm.
I think a lot of people they see what they were taught in school. People who were trained in the sciences will often they'll see graphs like the Darwinian tree of life. They'll see examples of evolution, and there's even a lot of if you read a biology textbook, like I took a biology class when I was a senior. It was a secular biology class, and it one of the our assignments was to read a whole article about how creationism wasn't science.
Yeah.
And so and that's a high school class.
Yeah.
So the further along the line you go, the more and more there's social pressure
Hmm.
and therefore embarrassment about rejecting evolution. And so in an attempt to jive their faith, they don't want to let go of God. With Genesis, they
Hmm.
just incorporate evolution in there. And with science, I mean, science is basically the process of science is basically saying, here's my idea, attack it.
Yeah.
And so there's a huge or sort of a passion like conflict, tear each other apart sort of mentality within the scientific community. And so there is sort of a political aspect to it. You know, there's sort of some gatekeeping in science, like we don't let certain ideas into science. And so it's one of those things where they'll say, well, yeah, but I just do my science. I go to church on Sundays and then I come to work
Hmm.
and I do my
Yeah.
science. So theistic evolution is the only name they can claim,
Yeah.
uh, if
So,
that makes sense.
so it sounds like, whereas a creationist would say, "Here's the Bible. I believe nature will correspond to it, but I begin with the Bible," and they're open about that. Evolutionists, theistic evolutionists, they'll say, "Well, no, we're going to start with the most prominent scientific conclusions,
Mm,
and then we're going to go into the Bible and look for connections." But it's sort of the difference of beginning.
right.
Do you begin with revelation? Do you begin with nature?
Mhm,
Okay. One last thing is um, theistic evolution is different from creation, as we've seen.
mm,
And that's true when it comes to origins. But what about other doctrines? How does theistic evolution affect other doctrines, including but not limited to the fall, the image, being image bearers of God, all of humanity, stuff like that? How does theistic evolution affect other doctrines of the faith?
mm. Well, it does affect the doctrine of being made in the image of God. And that's one of the I hesitate to use this when talking about any sort of theological system, but I think this is one of those camps where it applies. I think it's an aberrant view of humanity to say that we were once anything less than the image of God. For one thing, you have to argue that there were humans that weren't made in
Hmm.
God's image.
Yeah.
If you go to the Smithsonian Institute of Natural History, you'll see a whole wall of human skulls. They're of different shapes, and they'll say that they belong to different species, and there's explanations other than evolution as to why those skulls exist and where they came from. But a lot of those are real human skulls.
Hmm.
And basically what we're doing is we're showcasing God's image bearers and saying they weren't.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And on top of that, what you have is the doctrine of God's goodness, where God is not only allowing or creating humans that aren't made in his image, but the human beings that are made in his image are dying before sin enters the world. Now, death, scripture is very clear, death entered through sin. One man sinned, and through that man's sin, death entered the world.
Hmm.
And so now, of course, that we know that part of that was a spiritual death, and that's what theistic evolutionists would say, is that was referring to a spiritual death, and that's true because Ephesians makes it very clear it's a spiritual death. But we also know from Genesis where it says, "From the ground you came, or from the dust you came, to dust you shall return," that referring to physical death. We also know that Jesus had to die a real physical death.
Hmm.
And so the Bible's very clear that physical death is an enemy.
Hmm.
And so that goes against God's goodness and honestly sort of attacks the atonement. We also have the doctrine of federal headship, where Adam is our federal head. We descend from Adam. Because we descend from Adam, we're sinful,
Hmm.
we're sinners. Of course, Christ is the new and better Adam. Christ died for us, and once we come to Him, we are under His headship. And so, if you don't have a literal Adam, which theistic evolutionists don't believe in a literal Adam, at least for the most part, um, you don't have that headship, that doctrine of headship. So those are the three primary doctrines that fall under fire.
Okay. Any final thoughts about theistic evolution?
Don't believe
That'll work.
it.
All right. Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.